With the arrival of Alpha 4.0 and server meshing, one of the most significant milestones in Star Citizen development history has finally gone to live. Well, sort of, though it may have taken a bit longer than many of us, including Chris Roberts, probably anticipated. So then, what's next in 2025? Well, the letter from the chairman alongside the latest patch for the game 4.0.1 gives us a little bit of a glimpse where Chris outlined plans to decouple features from content, allowing for more frequent content updates, alongside a renewed focus on playability. While he didn't go into any specifics, I saw this as an opportunity to gather some feedback from the community, that's you guys, to see what playability means to you. And I also got a good idea of what you want to see for new content and features along the way. So let's jump into this interactive style content, and if you along the way like this kind of video, please let me know by hitting that like and subscribe button to show your support. Just as I hope you'll stick around to hear about the sponsor of today's video, NordVPN. I know you guys have already heard about them from tons of other creators like me, but I really have used them for years before I even got sponsored, which is why I was really happy to work with them. I got sick of using shady free VPNs, which I knew I couldn't trust with my info, just so I could get access to websites that I needed to for work while I'm abroad in Taiwan. So now with Nord, I can do my job and even watch shows that aren't available here in Taiwan as a bonus, like Stargate SG-1, an absolute sci-fi classic. So if you're looking for a reliable VPN service and you want to support my channel along the way, you can head on over to nordvpn.com/morphologist to get a huge discount on the 2-year plan, plus get 4 additional months for free. That's nordvpn.com/morphologist, and if none of it really works for you, you can always get your money back with their 30-day money-back guarantee. To better understand Chris Roberts' discussion on separating content and features and focusing on playability, let's break it down. There's a lot of nuance in these terms, and interpretations are going to vary depending on your background, but Chris has a very specific meaning here with the way he said it. He's emphasizing the delivery of more activities with the existing game framework. In more technical terms, tech features or technology developed for Star Citizen has the potential to create additional content by leveraging the existing structures. For example, server meshing is a tech feature that enables CIG to continually expand the gameplay space, provided that they have enough server capacity. This could mean even adding a new star system like Pyro or Stanton using the existing 4.0 framework, so think Nyx. Regarding features, these refer to new activities that require additional technology, introducing new code into Star Citizen. This can lead to things like bugs that disrupt gameplay. So by isolating these new features in a separate build, CIG aims to address these issues before introducing them into the persistent universe where players progress and earn ships. This approach means patches may introduce new content while leaving features in a separate build until they're ready to go. Playability, on the other hand, is subjective and challenging to define. Well, we can be pretty certain it includes things like bug fixing and performance optimization, especially based on their intentions to isolate new features into separate builds from the live environment. It may also involve polishing and reworking existing features for ease of use. We've seen a little bit of that in 4.0.1, where they've gone and changed a couple of old ships like the Nomad, giving it a personal inventory, and doing the same for the Mantis. So the door is really open to define it, and that is where you guys come in. I asked you guys to sound off in my community section here on my YouTube channel to let me know what you guys were thinking about what Chris said, and he had a lot of different ideas, so let me try to summarize it here. To absolutely nobody's surprise, the most consistent request from the community is to fix the game. The difficult part of giving feedback on this, though, is that Star Citizen's issues aren't just limited to simple issues with code or poor performance. There are broken missions and mission sharing, outposts with holes in them that let you fall through the ground, desyncing, dysfunctional elevators and transit systems, numerous AI behavior issues, issues with ships like missing geometry or broken functionality. The list could fill a video by itself. There is also just an enormous backlog of problems that have built up over the years and have become so normalized by players that they're just part of the scenery, and you don't notice them until a new player comes along and says, "Hey, why is this weird thing this way?" So then, at an absolute minimum, reducing issues with features and content that are frequently touched by players would go a long way to improving playability. A good start would be to look at fixing what players typically interact with each session, like issues with elevators, shop kiosks, ATC terminals, requesting takeoff, ship flight issues, followed by various popular missions and loops like mining, salvage, bounty hunting, mercenary missions, and so forth. What it comes down to is that it's just not fun to spend hours on an activity only for the reward to be a game-breaking issue that ends the session short. This is exactly the kind of experience that turns what would have been a long-term fan and backer into somebody who couldn't care less about the game. I'm sure some longtime players of the game will be able to share countless examples of this, even from the past couple of days. I know I sure can. If by the end of 2025 this goes from a regular occurrence to a rare one, then that would be a significant achievement. Good news is that right at the start of this year, CIG pretty much confirmed that this is going to be their focus with the release of 4.0.1 in the first PTU of the year that has over 100 bug fixes in it, not to mention a slew of quality of life improvements. That's only the first week since they've been back. A couple more weeks of stuff like this and they'll be well on their way to making 4.0 a far more reliably playable experience. However, as many have pointed out in the community, like Veptis, Stumafu, and Refi, there's a lot of improvements to make outside of just bug fixing. Simple functionality and UI surrounding inventories and looting, for example, is an easy point for CIG to improve. As many have requested before, inventories need search functionality and better, more responsive sorting functions. Further, looting and equip logic needs streamlining. For example, it's not clearly communicated that a backpack cannot be equipped without a chest piece, and it can feel frustrating when an item can't be looted due to having an attachment to another item. This is something that a lot of new players have reportedly struggled with when looking at my new player guide comments in my recently released guide for 4.0. And if one new feature has shown how weak the inventory system actually is in the game, it's got to be the contested zones. It's been a constant struggle to try to use fuses to put them in doors and to retrieve them from walls, to take out key cards and place them in the door easily without having to fumble through your inventory, in the meanwhile getting shot at by players and NPCs. It just creates so much friction in an otherwise enjoyable loop that it detrimentally affects the experience. Traveling, too, could be made easier with clearer UI markers and better descriptions for locations with their respective resources and amenities. This also means completing work on the mapping system and enabling functionality of waypoints in all locations for better overall navigation. Quantum jumping too could be improved and streamlined. Think more intuitive jump splines that don't require multiple short jumps to get from A to B. But maybe one of the more obvious touch points to address is one pointed out by Conrad Larson and many others, and that's to improve Star Citizen's spaceships. Many of them have fallen further and further behind in functionality with designs that no longer work well with gameplay systems. It's a classic issue with Star Citizen that ships are often introduced and then sold before the features that they advertise to enable are actually in the game, which predictably always creates problems later on. CIG could make huge strides in playability by bringing the worst offending ones up to speed, by bringing them up to gold standard and making design adjustments to better suit the new systems that they've developed. A small example would be the Freelancer's midsection cargo bay, which can't be accessed due to the doors being too small to fit even a 1 SU box through. However, it still has an SU grid in there. And that's far from the worst offender. Ships like the Aurora and Mustang, which are starter ships for 2 players, lack accessible inventories, weapon racks, usable cargo grids, and accessible components. The result is a frustrating experience, especially for new players when trying to engage with entry-level gameplay loops that these ships are currently just ill-suited to enable. Luckily, it looks like CIG are already on this one with the latest patch in the PTU. They adjusted the Aurora's cargo rack to make cargo just a bit more accessible beneath, but there's still a lot of room for improvement. And since we're on the subject of starters, injecting my own opinion here, I feel like the design philosophy behind starter ships needs to be reconsidered just a little bit. Shifting to better all-arounders as opposed to going the specialized route as CIG seems to have been doing recently. New players can't be expected to know which loop they're going to find more interesting when they're first starting, so it makes more sense to give them a fair chance at participating at as much as possible before deciding on what to buy in-game or on the website next. So this would mean identifying current starter ship weaknesses and addressing them to make their abilities a bit more balanced with each other with only slight differences in favor of identity and flavor. And since we're talking about buying internet spaceships, some players like Advo Archist want to see the game look more obtainable and less intimidating to new players, referencing the FOMO tactics that are often used by the marketing team and the high ship prices being something that can turn some players away. This one's a bit more difficult to address though, as Star Citizen depends on the success of ship sales in order to continue development. One way to address it then would be to ensure ship balance offers a choice as opposed to outright advantages for newer, more expensive ships, which they already do to some extent, but it's sadly offset by the fact that a lot of older ships are just really outdated, making them less better suited to playing the game that we have today. So fixing this would make the game feel a bit more balanced and make some of the older ships not feel so inferior to new ships. But what about Star Citizen's performance? Well, players like Vlanchov and countless others are increasingly calling for optimization and enhanced performance in the game. And this is just a natural progression of the gaming industry, as screens that go above 60 FPS are becoming more and more affordable to a wider audience. People are starting to notice the difference between low frame rate and high frame rate games. That's why we're starting to see a lot of performance enhancing features like DLSS and FSR becoming standard in pretty much every new game. And although CIG did introduce some of these features last year, Star Citizen still lacks the support for their latest versions. But even with those features, they'd still be merely temporary fixes, as the underlying raster performance of the game can still drop into the 20s or even teens on the most powerful systems players can get their hands on today. And this has yet another detrimental effect on attracting new players whose, again, expectations are much higher than they were just a couple of years ago. I saw countless complaints in my new player guide about low FPS performance and how it's just unacceptable. So further enhancements and development on Vulkan to bring the frame rates higher, as well as introducing the latest variations on AI enhancing techniques, would make Star Citizen much more performant. This should also extend to things like trash cleanup, which is clearly affecting the game's performance server side and client side, as pointed out by Midnight Wolf SDJ, which just beyond the performance also makes the game look a lot more visually, well, messed up. It looks like there's just trash laying everywhere, and it would be much more visually consistent if there was targeted cleanups of where players are leaving the most amount of garbage. I never stared at a pile of medical smocks or bottles and said, gee, the game is so much more immersive for all this garbage. Beyond that, there's also room for iteration on existing systems. One of the big ones cited by players like Raven9Line is the current flight model. While opinions diverge on how to solve it, the consensus amongst a lot of players is that it's falling short in delivering a consistently fun experience. My take on it is that the current balance creates unexpected and sometimes frustrating outcomes, such as a racing ship like the M50 handily taking down a military spec F-7A Mark II regularly in larger fleet engagements. Single fighters solo killing a manned gunship like the Hammerhead can also sometimes happen. This issue is maybe one of the most complex ones to solve though, as there are many contributing factors to balance like weapon damage, ship health, component attributes, space versus atmospheric performance, and yet to be introduced systems like ship armor, weapon damages, and engineering gameplay. The list honestly just goes on, and these issues can't and won't be solved overnight, but it still requires continuous iteration to get there so that we can test which solutions work and which don't. The same could be said for ground combat gameplay. There's little differentiation right now between different armor types and weapons, leading to most to just go for heavy armor and an FS9 LMG as the best options for pretty much every situation. Some of this could come down though to having more tech features introduced, like FPS scanning, which could, for example, create scenarios where heavy armor generates a bigger signature than light armor, allowing you to be more stealthy by playing with light armor. But it's just one possibility, and there seems to be a lot to explore here. Moving beyond fixing and polishing though, there's still a lot of possibility for how the game could be improved by adding more content on the back of the existing framework of the game. The most commonly suggested new content from players like A Child of Bodom and Minmul is to add new missions alongside narratively driven quest lines. It seems pretty obvious when you think about it. While the library of missions has definitely grown over the years, they remain sparse in diversity and quantity. The rewards also need to be examined and should extend beyond just a cash incentive, with interesting, rare, and perhaps even unique loot being possible to obtain by doing them. With Pyro more than doubling the play space and server meshing more than quadrupling the server's player count, there also needs to be a greater increase in mission location variety. The current limited number of locations means that oftentimes duplicate missions get piled up on top of each other, causing them to fail or complete unpredictably due to multiple players at the same location trying to complete similar objectives. The way these missions interact with the universe is also another interesting aspect to explore as content is expanded. Introducing hauling missions that take players between Stanton and Pyro, for example, could be a more lucrative contract that balances risk versus reward. Player-triggered missions like the simple Comare and Security Post Correa ones could be expanded and explored further as they relate to different factions. Attacking an outpost at the behest of one faction could, for example, trigger a defense mission for the defending faction. Regardless of what's chosen, players like Stratobrick and Asgunare, sorry if I'm butchering your name, think that this should go hand in hand with further leveraging of the reputation system, enhancing a sense of player progression. Introducing in-game rewards like titles or unique cosmetics for building a rep with a faction could give an even greater depth of purpose to gameplay. It need not even be that complicated. One can imagine higher reputation missions taking players to locations where there are better loot spawns, with perhaps even a hangar that gives a ship at the higher levels. Eventually, voice-acted mission givers and more complex NPC encounters would greatly enhance a sense of immersion in the universe as you play through each of these missions. On the subject of NPCs, numerous backers also commented and voiced a desire to see more NPC activity in the verse. Once upon a time, a vision for a game where there were more NPCs than players doing the exact kind of thing that we are was shared by Chris Roberts. Today, NPC encounters we frequently have are just at mission locations or landing zones where they feel static and disconnected. New voice lines were added in 4.0 for chatter, but imagine how alive the game would feel if NPC ships could be seen coming and going from landing zones, outposts, space stations, or even jump points. Imagine how that would change the gameplay for every loop in the game. It's not uncommon to see this in other MMOs, so why not Star Citizen? And as a bonus to adding more locations for these missions, it would unlock the possibility of bringing players to incredible vistas scattered around the universe. There's tons of moons and planets that are just rich with places to see that players won't interact with because there's no gameplay driving them to the surface to experience it. So giving them some meaningful gameplay to drive them to those locations could make the world feel a lot bigger than it does right now, as sometimes given the limited locations, it can feel vastly smaller than it actually is. But if we were to look at the most extreme example of new content that they could add, it would be new star systems. But I'm hesitant to say that that's any kind of priority because without any of the other systems I've talked about, they might just feel empty if they don't feel full and rich with life. And this leads me to my concern with what's been said about the direction in 2025. Playability and content are really important to filling out what's already there, but the problem still remains that Star Citizen consists of isolated islands of content and features. Fixing what's there will only serve to further highlight the lack of depth and purpose in what we do. For example, why do we mine, salvage, bounty hunt, or perform any action in the game other than for just monetary reward or for the immersion of the experience? Connecting loops through tech features like base building and crafting still needs to be a goal in 2025, even if the tech features introduced are only basic at first. I can see, for example, creating a crafting system at NPC stations where players input a recipe of materials and receive a crafted item with enhanced stats depending on the material's quality. Just doing something simple like this would connect a bunch of loops together, like mining, salvage, hauling, and combat, as players work together to find and hold the best material sources and bring them to stations to craft better components and get an advantage over others. This approach would also give CIG time to develop a wealth of recipes and figure out balance well before it connects with the more complex systems of base building and space station building. But what gets talked about even less, that still needs a great amount of effort on CIG's part, is to continue developing player-facing communication systems that bridge these different systems and islands of content together in a way that players can understand that they exist and know what their relationships are. What I mean is, for example, a market app to direct players to find basic items in the verse, also giving players a way to sell looted items for profit. A trader app in the Mobiglass to help understand commodity prices and plan trading routes without having to rely on clunky third-party workarounds. Robust and complete community tools to help us better organize and play together with things like org coffers and org entities like ships. a more complete scanning system for ships and players on the ground to help players identify points of interest, items of interest, trading lanes, hostile ships and locations, with interesting counter gameplay connected to a more complete map system that shows the surface topography of planets and moons. An overhauled ship loadout manager to help us better understand what we can equip to our ship and understand what stats that they have so that we know what's better than what and what has a different kind of trade-off, rather than relying on third-party things like Urkel to help us figure out ship fitting, which should just be something that we could do in-game. Look, what it really comes down to is that Star Citizen has a lot of complex systems and they have a lot of plans for even more complex relationships, but if it's not being communicated what's happening, it can just come off as a bug or something that players will never see or know that they can interact with. That's kind of always been the problem with Star Citizen. And I think advertising that they're working on these more ambitious features will keep people interested in the game in the short term. Fixing bugs and optimizing is definitely necessary, but it can't alone drive continued interest in the game. Ambition is what drives excitement, which can be infectious and can be the best kind of organic marketing, especially when goals are achieved. Despite my concerns though, going into 2025, I'm feeling very positive about the year ahead. While 4.0 came out later than hoped, CIG still put it out in what was essentially a live environment over the holidays, yielding, I'm sure, a trove of data to leverage for rapid fixes, which is exactly what we're starting to see just right in the first week since they've been back. The year is starting then strong with a functioning form of server meshing, giving the devs a great foundation to build on leading up to the first major release in this year's Q1 release. I look forward then to when they finally communicate what their vision is for the next series of patches in more concrete terms. Summarizing your posts has been a monumentally difficult task, as nearly everything you guys said was completely reasonable and valid. So if something you mentioned didn't get included here, I'm sorry, I just didn't have time to include every single thing. I needed to get this video out at some point, and it definitely didn't help that one of my hard drives died this week, losing half of my footage. Still, I think that this has been a really helpful exercise, and I want to continue here in the video's comment section where you guys can help fill in some of the gaps that I left. So let me know what your thoughts are down below, and as always, if you like this video, you know what to do. Hope to see you in the next one.